Naming things in your scene, especially your bones, is a super important habit to get into early on. So in this lesson, I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk about my naming convention and your naming convention. First, what is a naming convention? Well, it's a set of rules that you stick to when you're naming things. This makes things consistent, easier to remember, and hopefully logical. Now, your naming convention doesn't need to be the same as mine or anyone else's for that matter, although there are some inbuilt features in Blender that you can use to your advantage as a rigger, and there are already some common conventions out there. So if you have a smart naming convention, you can save yourself a bunch of time and mental energy. I'll do my best to explain what all that means, but I'll start by talking about some of my rules. Name everything. That means bones, objects, data, absolutely everything. Now, we're not going to worry about this rule for some of the demonstrations in this course, where we're just adding bones and whatever, just for demonstration purposes. However, if we're creating anything real, inverted commas, we are certainly going to name absolutely everything. Be consistent. Now, it's okay if your naming convention changes or evolves over time, but it should remain consistent within the same rig. In fact, in preparing this lesson, it has forced me to look back at some of my past work, and I've noticed a bunch of inconsistencies, so I'm now inspired to work harder at this. Make it easy to read. Now, I've purposely made that difficult to read to emphasize my point, because at the end of the day, you are going to be the one who has to find the names of the bones, and also the animator needs to be able to read and find the bones as well. So if you have a name that is easy to read, it's going to make everybody's life a lot easier. Now, you don't need to copy what someone else has done in their naming convention without thinking about it first. Now, there are some common conventions out there, then sure, that makes sense to use the same thing because everyone knows what we're talking about. But if it's a redundant naming convention that's come from other software, or it's someone else's bad habit, then I want you to really think about it before you decide whether that's something that you want to add to your naming conventions. I'll speak more about this later on. Be logical. Now, sometimes this might mean that you need to break one of your rules in order to keep it logical. And I think that is more important than trying to find the perfect naming system, which is going to work in every situation. Sometimes you just need to break a rule to make it logical. And don't do things more than once when you don't have to. If your character is symmetrical or has some symmetrical parts, Blender has some inbuilt features to be able to copy your work from one side to the other. We will take a look at that right now. When you're dealing with a part of the rig that is symmetrical, for example, the left arm and the right arm, Blender is smart enough to recognize the left and the right sides, as long as you use a specific naming convention. You need to tell it which side is left and right using either a suffix or a prefix, and you need to use a separator as well. Now, there's many valid examples, but let's take a look at some of them now. All right, so here's a bone. Let's give it a name. Bone name. Very creative, Wayne. Good work. So now we either need to give it a prefix or a suffix. Here's a list of some of the valid options. I'm only showing you the left, but obviously the opposite of that is right. So the first one is the lowercase l, then we've got an uppercase L. We've got the whole word left, and there's many different spellings for that. Doesn't matter what case that you use. And then we have 4 valid separators. That would be a decimal point or the dot, the period, a space, a hyphen, or an underscore. Let's just choose one of these valid examples. Bone name.l, this would be acceptable, or we could do left underscore bone name. Now, just as a reminder, this separator here doesn't need to be the same as any of the other ones. They can be different, they can be the same. It really doesn't matter. Blender is just going to look at the prefix with the separator at the start or the end of the name. Now let's have a look at a few bad examples. We've got left name, and this won't work because there is no separator. So Blender just sees this as one big chunk of letters. We've got name.left. That won't work for the same reason. In this example, name.l.more words. This won't work either because the L is in the middle of the name and Blender will get confused. Although there is one exception to this, and that is if you use name.l.001 or something like that. Blender is smart enough to figure this out because that's one of its internal naming conventions. When it duplicates a bone, it will append the 001 to the end. So if you've got those numbers on the end, it will, although that's not good practice in my opinion. So let's take a look at how you symmetrize or you mirror these things from one side across to the other. So here we are inside Blender, and I've just gone ahead and created a whole bunch of valid names that we'll be able to symmetrize across to the other side. These top 2 rows are using the underscore separator. You can see the names here, underscore left, underscore capital, all capitals. So these ones are using the underscore, and these bottom 2 rows are using the dot separator. You can see the dot separator there. So these are all valid examples. We either as a suffix or a prefix. If we actually wanted to symmetrize them over to the other side. Now, obviously the middle of our rig is this part here. I've just put a bone there called middle. So it was going to symmetrize across to the other side of that. And that is because that is where the origin point of our armature is. All right, back to edit mode. Now I'm going to select all of these bones here. Now by default, if you're using the left click select, you just right click and then you'll see the symmetrize option here. Although because I am right click select, I have to hit the W key to get that option up here. It's available in the armature menu here. You just see armature and then symmetrize. So I'm going to choose this option here and you'll see all of those names are valid. So it's just flip them across to the other side. So the underscore left has turned out to be underscore right, etc. So it's smart enough to figure out all of those different patterns and mirror them across. Now you saw in that example, those bones did not exist. So it will create them for you. And it will also set up any hierarchy or copy over any constraints. Although if the bone that you're trying to constrain it to doesn't exist, it's not going to work as expected. Now, at the time of this recording, the only thing that doesn't copy across when you do it this way is any drivers. You'll need to go ahead and manually create them. I've spoken to the developers about this, and after many years of nagging, they're actually, at the time of this recording, working on a solution. So, yay! Now, just some more things to note. If the bones already do exist and we want to symmetrize them, so you'll see it there. If we do that again, I'm just going to symmetrize. It's going to move them into the symmetrical location of the bone that you have selected. So it doesn't have to create the bones for you. It can just reposition them. Although there's one more option that I want to show you, and that is the symmetry button up here, or the X-axis symmetry. If I select that and now I grab this bone, because these bones are already created, it's going to keep them in sync. So that is very handy. If you've already got some bones created and you need to make an update to one side, it's going to propagate over to the other side automatically. All right, so that is the symmetry with the left and the right sides. Let's take a look at my full naming convention, starting at the object level. So here is our beloved Melvin character. Now this character only has 2 objects in the rig, but other characters can have more. Now I'm using the word rig interchangeably to mean all the objects that are needed to move the character, as well as just the armature object. This is one of those words that has many different meanings depending on the context. Okay, so in this rig, we have 2 objects. We have Melvin underscore rig, which is also the armature object. So rig and armature mean the same thing. And we have Melvin underscore geo. Now geometry is also called mesh. But you notice the naming convention, I always have the character name first and then the label of what it is. So that way they remain alphabetical. But this is one of the inconsistencies that I was talking about earlier. So I have the capital letters for geo and only have the lowercase for rig. Now I did this for ease of readability, but now I'm thinking maybe I should be consistent and have everything in capital letters. Regardless, this is something that I am working on and hopefully you will work on too. Now it's also worth noting before we move on that this is the names of the container objects, and I also duplicate this name for the data. And if you get into this habit, it will make your life a lot easier when you need to append data from one file into another. Just trust me on that one. So this example only had 2 objects, but as I mentioned before, you could have many more. You could have a mesh cage or mesh deformer to help you move. I would call that Melvin cage. If you have 1 lattice, you'll just call it Melvin lattice. If you had more than 1 lattice, you'll give it an extra label. You might say lattice head and lattice body. That's just to help clarify things there. Now, I always put the character name first, or the name of the object that I'm rigging first, so it remains alphabetical. Now, this really is my personal preference, but I use this same alphabetical approach to name the bones as well, which makes many rigging tasks a lot easier too. Now, before we get stuck into bone names and how I name them, let's take a look at the common pre-existing conventions. Now, it's common convention to name some bones with certain labels, like def, mech, control, IK, and FK. Now, you might come across some other abbreviations, but really that would be more personal preference rather than an industry standard in my opinion. So what do they mean? Now, def stands for deformation. These are the bones that actually deform your mesh. If you label them clearly, it's going to make your life easier. Now, MCH or mech is short for mechanism. Now, these bones are needed to make the rig function in a specific way. They're helper bones essentially. They don't move the geometry, but they actually help the bones do what you want them to do. Now, control, this should be pretty obvious. These are the controls that the animator will use, although in my opinion, this is a redundant label, which I will explain in a moment. And then we have IK and FK. These stand for inverse kinematics and forward kinematics. We will learn about IK and FK later. However, these labels would only be used when you have a limb that can switch between the two modes. It would be redundant to label everything with the FK label if that part or that body part didn't have an IK equivalent. Now, when you name a bone chain, what I like to do is give it a numerical number working from the start of the chain to the end. Let's just imagine this is an antenna. It's antenna 1, antenna 2, antenna 3, antenna 4. I want you to notice that I'm using a capital letter for the first A in this one. And that is the way that I signify that this is a control bone without having to put CTRL in the name. So where do I put the special labels? Well, let's imagine that these were deformation bones. Let's have a look at what I would call them then. I would put the label at the end, so all these bones still remain alphabetical. So all the antenna bones, or all the ones that are related to that antenna 1, stay alphabetical. All the ones that are related to antenna 2 stay alphabetical. And if this needed to be duplicated across to the other side, you would put the .L at the end. Now, the reason I use the snake case with the .L at the end is for ease of reading. The way we read is actually by recognizing the shape of the word first before the actual letters or the word. So I believe that the snake case is by far the easiest to read, and the dot separator at the end, that is the .L, quickly shows that this part is different to the rest. I mostly use all lowercase, but with capitals to emphasize certain parts, like the special labels or the .L. Makes it easier to read than the lowercase .L. Now, all the controls have a capital letter at the start, which helps for readability for the animators. And remember that these are the only bones that they should be touching. So I do not put the control in the name either at the start or the end, because that is redundant. It also means that the animator has to look partway through the word to actually see what the name of the bone is. Now, there's a few more things I do in specific cases. However, what I've mentioned here is the main concept, and there's enough information for you to grasp what I do in other situations, and either adapt it for your own situations or completely disregard it if you like to work in a different way. Now let's talk about some of my pet peeves. Now, it is really annoying when you're an animator if a bone chain is labeled incorrectly. So you have the start of the chain might be labeled with start and the end might be labeled with tip. Something like that. Just like keep them all numerical. That way, when they show up in the dope sheet or the graph editor, they are alphabetical and they're not out of order. It makes it really easy to animate. Another pet peeve is when a name is left as .001 at the end or .002. This to me just says that someone hasn't taken the time to label all their bones. Another thing is all caps. This just feels like it's shouting at me. I find it really difficult to read. As I mentioned before, the way that humans read is by recognizing the shape of the words. And if the shape is all capitals, it is really, really difficult. One more thing that I try to avoid or I dislike is when the numbers of a bone is concatenated with the name. Say, for example, finger 01, finger 02. I just find it easier to read when you have a separator. Now, I also dislike having the mech or the def as a prefix because, as I mentioned, it ruins the alphabeticalness, and I find it really difficult to read as well because you really have to look halfway up the word to actually find what the name of the bone is, rather than looking at the start of the word and you know what the name of the bone is. And finally, if something has the control prefix, I find this redundant. Now, having said all that, there is a reason why you might see the def, the mech, and the control listed as a prefix rather than a suffix like I do, and that is if you are using something like Rigify. And this is because it uses Python to search the start of the name, and then it can easily identify those bones and do a certain operation with them. However, if you're not doing anything fancy with Python like this, I think readability is more important. So that's why I opt to not put these labels at the start, because it makes it harder for the animators to read. All right, so that's a lot of information for this lesson. Hopefully it made sense, and hopefully it inspired you to start thinking about your own naming convention. Now, as I said, it doesn't need to be the same as mine, but hopefully you choose a logical one.